Hello, thank you so much for clicking on this video. My name is Victoria and I'm currently in training to become a yoga teacher. And today I'm going to be sharing with you my favorite go-to yoga poses at the moment. These are the poses that I come back to again and again in my personal practice. So, in no particular order, let's get started with Locust Pose or Shalabhasana. This is one of my favorite warm-ups for the back of the body. Unlike Cobra Pose, there's no chance to rely on my hands to push myself deeper into the back bend. I find that it really activates the muscles along my back, and I usually like to substitute Cobra Pose with Locust Pose in sort of later rounds where my back already feels a little bit warmed up. To get into Locust Pose, start lying belly down with your hands down by your sides, palms facing down. From here, using your hands for support, lift the head and chest up off the mat, activating the back muscles to do so. You can stay here if this is comfortable, or if you'd like to take it a little further, you can lift one or both legs up into the air, reaching the feet back towards the back of the mat. There's also the option to lift the hands up off the mat and reaching them back towards the heels. I love how active Locust Pose feels. It really engages those muscles along the back of the body that create that arch shape in the spine. And if you're lifting the legs also, the glutes and the hamstrings on the back of the leg will kick in too. Although the main focus of Locust Pose is to activate those muscles along the back of the body, the front of the torso, including the front of the core and the front of the legs, will also be getting a gentle stretch here. There are a few variations of Locust Pose that I like to play with, depending on what I'm trying to achieve on that day. As I mentioned previously, you could keep your hands on the mat, just lifting the head and chest, if you want to focus more on the back muscles. And there's also the option to keep the chest on the floor and only lifting one or both legs. This will bring more of a focus onto the activation of the back of the legs in the glutes and the hamstrings. When I'm looking for more of a shoulder and a chest stretch, I'll also clasp my hands behind my back before lifting up into Locust and then reaching my knuckles back towards my heels. Next up is Standing Forward Fold or Uttanasana. This pose is taught in nearly every yoga class and with really good reason, I think. I find that it really stretches out the back of the body, so it kind of has the opposite action to Locust Pose. This is a pose that I'll find myself coming back to in every yoga practice, but also just during my day-to-day life when I feel like I need a really good stretch. For me, this pose has a really grounding effect, and it feels great when I'm very mentally scattered or when I'm physically tight. You can enter forward fold from standing position in mountain or walking the feet forward from downward facing dog. Both of these are really common transitions in yoga classes. There isn't one perfect way to do standing forward fold, as is the case with nearly every yoga pose, and it will look a little bit different for everybody. But the general guidance is to stand with the feet hip width apart, parallel to each other, and bend the knees as much as needed so that you can rest your belly on your thighs. And from there, you want to relax the entire back of your body, so your back and your head and your neck. Your hands can come to the floor, palms to the floor, or fingertips to the floor. In a standing forward fold, you're stretching out the entire back of the body, so the muscles of the back and also the hamstrings will be getting a really good stretch here too. Because your hips and your chest are over your head, standing forward fold is actually an inversion. And personally, I find that gentle inversions like this can have a really calming effect, and I know I'm not alone in thinking this. One thing I love about standing forward fold is that it's a really versatile pose. So if bringing your belly onto your thighs doesn't feel comfortable, you could keep your hands on your legs or even elbows on your thighs to find a more supported version of the pose. My favorite variation is to bring opposite hands to opposite elbows in what's known as a ragdoll pose and just let the upper body hang, letting it be pulled down by gravity. I really love this variation because it helps me to really let go of any tension in the muscles along my back and I can fully relax into the pose. And you could also choose to take a gentle sway from side to side in your ragdoll fold. When I want to explore a little bit more variation in the spinal movement, I might lift one hand up into the air to find a gentle twist, or even turning my torso so that I'm leaning more over one leg to find a gentle side bend. Even though standing forward fold might be a very simple shape, I really love how versatile it is, and there's so many different ways to explore this pose and make it your own. Reclined spinal twist, known as Supta Matsyendrasana, is my go-to cool-down pose in my personal yoga practice. But it can also work well as a warm-up pose to introduce gentle spinal movement at the start of the class. I will do this pose anytime. I especially love to do it in bed, either in the morning or even just before going to sleep. To find a reclined twist, lie on your back with your arms out in a T shape, and you want to keep this position in the upper body as you move into the twist. From here, pull both knees up into your chest and then lower both knees together down onto one side onto the floor. If the knees don't reach the floor, that's totally okay. You can always use a pillow or a folded blanket to support the knees as much as you need, and this will allow you to fully relax into the pose. I also sometimes like to bring one hand onto the top knee, and this just adds a little bit of weight and it'll help ground the knees into the floor a little bit more. A reclined twist gently mobilizes the spine, stretching out the muscles of the back and the outer hip of the top leg. On days when I'm looking for a bit more sensation in the stretch, I might straighten out that bottom leg so the twist is a little deeper, or even wrapping the top leg over the bottom leg, sort of like you would in eagle pose, if you're familiar with that posture. You may also feel a slight stretch in the chest and the front of the shoulder of the opposite arm, especially if you have it reached out in that T-pose position. Once I've settled into my reclined twist, I find that I can completely relax into the pose, and I feel like it is a perfect pose when you want a moment of stillness in your practice. This is why I especially love it at the end, just before moving into Shavasana. Vrikshasana, or tree pose, is, in my opinion, the best standing balance. I feel like I get a lovely steadiness kind of to the midline of the body when I'm pressing the foot into the standing leg and pressing the leg back into the foot. This is another pose that I'll find myself doing just around the house. I often like to do it actually when I'm brushing my teeth. So if I'm brushing, say, my top teeth, I'll balance on one leg, and then when I'm brushing my bottom teeth, I'll balance on the other leg. I think part of why I really like this pose is because it doesn't require a big warm-up like some of the more challenging standing balances, say dancer's pose, for example. I also like how easy it is to modify. So it can be made really accessible, and it's super versatile depending on what I'm looking for in my practice. To come into tree pose, start out in Tadasana, mountain pose with the feet standing hip width apart. Lift the heel of one leg and turn that knee out to the side. And then you can rest the heel onto the ankle of the standing leg. This is the most grounded version of the pose, keeping the toes of the lifted heel on the ground. But if you'd like to explore the pose a little more, you can bring the heel up a little higher, resting the foot on the calf of the standing leg, or even resting it up onto the inner thigh. There's also the option to play around with your hand position in tree pose, so you could keep your hands on your hips and even give the hips a gentle squeeze for a little more stability. You could bring your palms together at your chest, or even reaching the hands up overhead if you want to challenge your balance a little bit more. And of course, if you feel really unsteady here, there's always the option to find a little support from a chair or from a wall. Like all standing balances, tree pose is great to help train your balance, and this will help prevent injuries from accidental trips or falls. I think a lot of people tend to feel discouraged when they're doing standing balances in yoga because they think they shouldn't be wobbling. But I like to think of it more as when I wobble, when I'm doing a standing balance, that's actually my brain and my body learning how to catch me when I fall. So in this way, wobbling in a yoga pose is actually a good sign because it shows that the pose is doing its job. Next up is a modified side plank where you keep the bottom knee on the floor. I nearly always include this pose as a warm-up in my personal practice, especially after a couple of rounds of cat-cow. To come into this pose, start in tabletop, so hands on shoulders, hips over knees. From there, pivot the bottom leg out to the side so that the toes are pointing over. The toes will probably come off the mat actually, and they're pointing towards the long edge of the mat. And then you want to step the top leg back and pivot the foot so that the sole of the foot is laying flat on the floor and the toes are pointing out to the side. And then stacking the bottom wrist directly under the shoulder for the most stable foundation, lift the top arm up into the air, and that's your modified side plank pose. On its own, this pose adds a gentle load onto the bottom shoulder and the bottom wrist, so it'll warm up those joints. It also creates a little bit of engagement in the side of the core. But I think the real beauty of this pose is the extra movements that you can layer on to make it a more full body experience. My favorite variation is to make big circles with the top hand, so you're rolling out the shoulder joint, and then following that up with reaching the hand up to the sky and rolling around the wrist. I really like how this creates a nice contrast. You're creating stability in the bottom arm while simultaneously mobilizing the joints in the top arm. We can also add a little balance challenge by lifting the top leg up into the air and reaching the heel towards the back of the mat. This will engage the outer hip of that top leg, and it'll also work the side core a little more, and it'll add a little bit more weight into that bottom arm. This is a simple pose, but it's one that I find myself coming back to all the time. Gate pose, or purigasana, is another really great warm-up pose that I love to include in my yoga practice all the time. For me, this feels like a very open posture and makes me feel more energized for the class ahead. Because of that, I think it's great for a class in the morning or even for a midday pick-me-up. The leg position is going to be similar for the modified side plank. So one shin will be on the ground with the toes pivoted out to the side, and then the other leg will be extended out long. From there, the torso will come upright, and you'll bring one hand down on the extended leg, and the other hand will reach up and over into a side bend over that extended leg. The most obvious action of gate pose is going to be that side bending of the spine, so like mobilizing through the ribs of the stretched side. But that's not all that's happening. You're also stretching out the inner thigh and the hamstrings of that outstretched leg. And even though you're kneeling and you have quite a stable foundation, there is a little bit of a balance challenge as you're keeping yourself upright. I think this pose is a really nice prep pose if you want to come into triangle later on in your practice, because it works and it stretches a lot of the same muscles. You can also change up the position of the arms to change how the pose feels. So for a more grounded version, you might keep that top arm on the hip rather than reaching it up overhead. When I want to warm up the side of the core a little bit more and even add a little bit extra of a balance challenge, I might bring the hands behind my head before leaning over the outstretched leg, or even reaching the arms up overhead, and this will really work those muscles at the side of the core. Whatever version I choose, I love gate pose to wake up the body and to prepare me for whatever movement is coming next. Deer pose, or mrigasana, is more commonly taught in yin yoga practices. In fact, I think it might have even originated in yin yoga. I don't really see it taught often in vinyasa or hatha style classes. I think this is a really great alternative to pigeon. Many people find deer pose to be more accessible and easier on their knees than pigeon pose. To be honest, I'm not a big fan of pigeon personally. It's not a bad pose, but I will usually do deer pose instead of pigeon. For those who do want to practice pigeon, I think it's a great warm-up for that pose. You might also hear this called 90-90 pose in more general movement and exercise realms. That's because both knees form 90-degree angles. So the front leg, the knee will be in line with the hip, and then there will be a 90-degree angle at the knee, and the shin will be parallel with the front edge of the mat, so the short sides of the mat. And then the back leg, the knee will also be in line with the hip, but it'll be out to the side, and then there'll be a 90-degree angle at the knee with the shin parallel with the long edges of the mat. These perfect 90-degree angles are not right for everyone, and they might not be comfortable. And it's totally okay to tuck the feet in a little bit closer to your seat, or even a lot closer to your seat if that's more comfortable for you. The reason I prefer deer pose to pigeon pose is because you're getting that external rotation of the hip on the front leg, and you're getting that outer hip stretch, but at the same time, you're getting hip internal rotation on the back leg. And this action of internally rotating the hip is often neglected in a yoga practice because there just aren't a lot of poses that really incorporate it. There are a few variations of deer pose that you can take to change the feeling of the stretch. So you could fold forward over that front leg like you might do in pigeon pose. I like to experiment with the angle that I fold forward over that leg. So sometimes I might fold forward more over the foot, or I might fold more forward over the knee rather than directly over the shin. This just changes the sensation in that outer hip a little bit. And then there's also the option to lean back a little, and that'll give you more of a stretch on that back leg, that internal rotation that I was talking about previously. This version where you're leaning back can get pretty intense, so I like to move very slowly and mindfully, only going as far as is comfortable. For me, deer pose is one of those postures that can feel gently challenging, but at the same time really grounding. That wraps up the list of my favorite yoga poses that I keep coming back to at the moment. Did your favorite pose make the list? Or is there any poses that you really like that I didn't mention here? Let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed watching this video, let me know by giving the video a like and subscribing to the channel if you're interested in hearing more. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye bye!